it is 1:05, so I'm going to get started. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming not only to hear me speak, but in particular for supporting BSides. BSides is something that I'm very passionate about. For those of you who don't know, I run BSides Rochester, which has been around for 13 years. So I'm always excited to be able to present at a BSides. I don't usually present at my BSides, but I like to support the other ones. So we're going to be talking about defense. I'm sure you're shocked. If you don't want to talk about defense, maybe you shouldn't be here. This is our overall agenda. I'll tell you a little bit about me for those of you who don't know me. Bless you. We'll talk about some background and history and why it is I'm giving this talk. Because this wasn't just, hey, I did a thing and out of the blue came this idea. It was something that sort of coalesced over time in talking to people and my journey into this field. That will lead to discussions about defender assumptions, of which there are many, but you'll start to see some themes. And from there, we'll transition to immersion in offensive security, and you'll see why we wind up going in that direction. And then we'll do a summary, and then there should be some time for Q&A. Speaking of Q&A, what I will tell you is, welcome to ask questions. I'm one of these people that inevitably thinks of something, holds it in my brain, and then the minute they say, anybody have questions, I forget. So don't feel like you got to wait till the end. Just jump in and ask questions as we're going. All right, so this is a little bit about me. Up in this corner here, I have Flash. Flash is my adoptive sloth at the Buffalo Zoo. He is my buddy. I haven't seen him in a while, but yeah, I love sloths. You will see that as a theme later. I do a lot of things in a lot of places. I've been at the University of Buffalo for a very long time. Like I said, I'm on staff with a bunch of conferences. I volunteer with yet additional conferences. I've spoken at a few things, and as I mentioned, I love sloths. All right, so how did I get here? I get asked this a lot by students. How did you get to where you are? And first of all, getting to where I am in terms of my day job is very different from how did I get here. So what I'm going to talk about when I say how did I get here, I'm talking about how did I get here, not how did I get to the job that I do day to day, because that's a very different story. So basically, I had started in the security office at the University of Buffalo in 2009 full-time, and I was doing forensics work, which I very much enjoy. I built their Forensics for Compliance program. And I was doing what I would consider sort of traditional security stuff, right? So because the university has 3 campuses and a lot of people, there is no way at the time, 3 of us, so we're talking like 35, 40,000 students, 10,000 faculty staff, 3 campuses, and 3 people to do security. So we can't possibly truly secure all the things. That's not possible. So what we really do is we act more as consultants, and we talk to folks about, here are recommendations, here are guidance documents. If you have a question, they call and say, we're seeing this, what do we do? I can tell you about the very first phone call I got about ransomware, and this was the early days, so ransomware wasn't, oh my goodness, they're attacking our entire domain. It was, this machine got hit with ransomware. So this is the really early days. This is the sort of conversation I would have. I manage abuse at Buffalo EDU, so if somebody were to send us something, I was dealing with that. So I had come out of a sysadmin role. I had done desktop support, I had done server support, and I knew the security stuff sort of associated with that. And because of the non-traditional way I came into the business, I was always interested in probably being more secure than your average sysadmin. And that isn't to say we don't have some phenomenal sysadmins, but it is true that I have found that most sysadmins, that's not their first focus. Their first focus is operations, which I completely understand, but is problematic, and we'll see why. So I got involved with a class called NetDef, which is really more of a independent study that UB started to offer, and it became a thing because one of our former students really wanted to participate in something called CCDC. Who's heard of CCDC? Anybody? A couple people. Yeah. So for those of you who have never heard of it, CCDC is the collegiate defense competition that occurs, cyber defense competition, that occurs regionally and nationally throughout the year. And essentially you get a group of students to compete, and they act as defenders. And then there are other folks who act as attackers. Their job is that they're consultants. They come in to help manage a network and to keep it running and to secure it. And while they're doing that, they get what are called injects, which are tasks. So they have to do all of these things that a sysadmin would have to do and a potential security team would have to do, and worry about being attacked at the same time. And so they get these little surprises along the way. So Chris, the student who'd heard about this, thought it was this fabulous idea, and he really, really wanted to bring it to UB. So NetDef was born of this. And we had all of these neat contributors who decided to join us to teach students how to defend systems. Some of the people that we got involved were in offensive security. Now at this point, I'd never heard of offensive security. I knew about defending and I knew about security, and that's what I knew, and that's fine. So I start hearing these words, offensive security, and I'm like, this is cool, I want to know more about it. So one of the guys who was involved in that, his name is Justin, and he now works for Dave Kennedy at TrustedSec, if you've heard of TrustedSec. And he said to me, I said, I want to learn about this, because he was, I think at the time, I think he was a pen tester. And I said, where do I go to learn about this? And he said, you should go to a BSides. And I said, what the heck is a BSides? Never heard of it, right? And I was like, all right. I Google BSides. I find BSides Rochester. I show up at my first BSides. I had absolutely no idea what I was walking into. Now, the first BSides Rochester that I attended was at the German House, which is this very weird space. That's the best way to describe it.
That was the weirdest BSides.
That was my first one.
Yeah, but it was neat. I mean, it was a neat space, but it was weird.
It was.
I don't know what the building was originally, but it may be a school. It had a stage.
It was an auditorium.
Was it? Yeah. So it had a stage, and there were talks. There was space where you could sit and you could chit chat with people, and there were things on the tables you could play with. And then there were talks upstairs and downstairs. It was a really unique space.
It's a really weird.
Yeah.
Is that the one someone gave the whack talk?
I don't remember.
I just remember the talks in the basement, those big columns.
Yes.
You're trying to
And
peek around to see the screen.
But it was, it was a unique environment. And even though I didn't know anybody personally, I mean, I literally went there knowing nobody, I felt very comfortable and very welcome. And some folks started working on some of the CTFs. And I was sitting at the table with some folks who were doing this. And I said, what are you doing? And they said, we're playing the CTF. And I was like, what's a CTF? I mean, I literally knew none of this. And they were really excited to show me. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. Like a place where I know nobody. Now, granted, I'm not going, if you hadn't guessed, I'm an extrovert. I have no problems talking to people. But even so, you can still go to conferences where you sit down and you say hello to the person next to you and they sort of grunt at you, and that's the entire conversation. And these folks were very willing to share what they knew. And that was exciting. And I was so tickled by that I decided I wanted to come back and I wanted to volunteer. And of course, as you know now, fast forward a bunch of years, I volunteered, and then ultimately I wound up on staff. So that's kind of the beginnings of how I got to this point. The more I learned about offensive security from attending first BSides, then I went to my first DEF CON. That was insane. And I went to several other hacker conferences. It was very eye-opening. So I know this movie's really old, but who's seen The Matrix? Okay, at least most of you. Yeah, so I'm telling you, so I used to teach some philosophy classes, and I would use The Matrix in them. And at one point, I would use The Matrix, and I had students who had no idea what I was talking about. They'd never seen The Matrix, and I thought, good Lord, I'm old. But if you remember The Matrix, you got the blue pill and the red pill and these different sides. And what I realized was that there's two sides to security. There's what we sort of typically know as defenders, patch the things and scan the things, but there's a whole other side to this. And I realized that I really hadn't known about any of this until I started going to these cons. So the fact that you're all here, thumbs up, because you're learning about that stuff. And really, to be a better defender, as you'll see, this is really what it takes. So before I get too deeply into this, I want to tell you what I mean when I say defensive security professional. Offensive, so I'll give you just a second to read this, because I don't need to read it to you. You're all very capable of doing that. It's more or less what you would expect. But I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. We good?
We're good.
Okay. This is what I mean by offensive security professional. And I'm purposely not using terms like red team, pen test, because there's a lot of conflict about what those words mean in the real world. I see giggles, so I know you all know what I'm talking about. So that's why I sort of put it in these two buckets at a very high level, because that's all that really matters for what I'm going to talk about. Are we good with that one? Okay. So what I want to do is talk about point of view. When I say there's sort of two sides to this, what I'm trying to get across is that from a traditional defender's point of view, we're going to build a web server, right? We're going to install the operating system. We're going to do all best practices. So if there's a best practice that's not listed here, just assume it's there. We patch the thing, we configure it correctly, we add the firewall, we do vuln scanning, we document everything. When we are done with all of these tasks, until there's, say, a new patch or something that comes out, we go, check, we're done. That's what we do. And there's no reason, in general, most people ever think beyond that. However, this is what an offensive security person sees for the same thing. They go, what can I do with that open port? Because I've done best practices, right? I've locked everything down except the ports that absolutely need to be open. But I have an open port because otherwise the product isn't functional. But your offensive security professional looks at that and goes, They look for things like input fields. Are they sanitized? Now, as a defender, if we're not doing app security, we don't think anything about that. But it matters. Because this is what your attacker is looking for. Which is, of course, why offensive security folks are doing that too. So these are just some other things. Hidden fields, any way that it's interesting. Can we, traverse the directory? And in my opinion, the most important question, what is its relationship to other systems? Now, how many of you think about this question when you stand up a new system? A couple of you. And that's awesome. But it also tells me most of you don't think about that. And that's okay. That's why I'm teaching you about this. Because offensive security professionals look at relationships. And so I really love this quote. So John Lambert coined this statement. Other people have said similar things, but he personally gave me permission to use it, so I use it all the time. And it's the idea that defenders are thinking in lists. We get things done and we check a box and we're good. But we need to think beyond that. That's half the story. We need to think of the other half of the story. Attackers think in graphs. And what he means by this, and I've had a couple discussions with people who are like, oh, it's not really true, it's not graphs. Yeah, okay, so the representation maybe isn't a graph. The important part is that it's a relationship between whatever they can get access to and whatever else is there. So at the end of the day, I think this is a really accurate statement. So this is what we're talking about with relationships. This is a screenshot from Bloodhound that Andy Robbins, whose handle is Waldo on Twitter, and I think he's on some of the other social media sites too now, he provided this graphical image from a product called Bloodhound. Bloodhound is amazing. If you're not familiar with it, it can show you paths from one entity to another. And what offensive security folks often do with this is they go, if I have access here, how can I get to domain admin? And I can tell you right now, there is probably nothing in your network that stops an attacker from getting on a box with a user that has no rights and getting this picture. Because you need very, very few permissions to be able to see this. If you have more permissions, you can see it even more in detail, right? But this is the kind of thing we're talking about, these relationships. All right, so where do defender assumptions come in? Well, we're going to see some additional assumptions that are part of the same idea. How many times have you been told, the cyber kill chain, just break the chain. If we break the chain, we're good. Anybody heard that? Yeah, I'm seeing head nods. So yeah, you've heard that, right? Well, what if I told you that somebody in offensive security, and likewise an attacker, finds that amusing because they're like, oh, you broke the chain here? Okay, well, what about if I come in over here? Because, see, I know there's a relationship over here instead of over here. So this is great in theory, but if you break the chain and then stop and don't go, all right, if they got in over here, how else could they have gotten in? Or how else could they get in? You've made a huge assumption and not a good one. What about this one? We're running EDR. We're running antivirus. We're good. Another really common assumption. Now, to our credit as defenders, I don't think there's anybody who really thinks if we're running these products, we're okay. But what I do think and have had experience with are people who think, my EDR caught Mimikatz, therefore Mimikatz didn't run, and we're good. That's not wrong. But guess what? There's lots of other ways to get passwords that don't involve Mimikatz. So just because I'm trying as an attacker to capture your password, is there anybody who doesn't know what Mimikatz is? Okay, so for anybody who doesn't know what Mimikatz is this awesome tool that lets you capture passwords. And it can pull them out of something called LSAS in memory. So it's really useful as an attacker. You get on someone's box that doesn't have any permissions and you capture, say, the admin stuff that's flying back and forth in the ethers, right? And Mimikatz is a tool that most EDR and AV products will catch. But attackers will sometimes try Mimikatz, and then when it doesn't work, they'll try something else, because there's lots of other ways. So if you make the assumption that your EDR or your AV caught whatever this badness is, and you stop, that's a bad assumption. Lots of ways to get around it. So tell me in here, who's in offensive security? Because I know there's a couple in here. Yeah. So for those of you who are in offensive security, do you agree with this? Like, you just kind of get around it. You either you find ways to either stop it, because if you stop it, now you're good, right? Now you don't have to worry about it. Or you just bypass it. Because as many EDR and AV companies as there are, somebody has been able to sit down for each one of those and figured out what the bypasses are. Whether or not they're legit entities, they exist. Every time a new one spins up or a new change happens, somebody figures out how to get around it. And it's all readily available. All that information's out there. And this was a huge surprise to me as somebody in defense. Like, sure, I knew there were things you could do, but like, companies that do that for a living? Like, I didn't know that, but there are organizations, that's what they do for a living, is figuring out these bypasses, because then they can sell them, and then attackers go, oh, it's $10, cool, now I know how to get around and fill in the blank. It's easy peasy. Anybody not familiar with LOL bins? Okay, so LOL bins are living off-the-land binaries. Great examples of that are basically any application or DLL on a system that can be used for things other than what it was intended. It is called a LOL bin, or living off-land binary, because it is part of the operating system. Attackers know it's there, they know how to use it for badness, and check it out, now they're not installing a new tool, so what's the chances that your AV, EDR, whatever, are going to find it. Like, they're not, right? So, I mean, these are just some of these examples that can happen. C2, if you're not familiar, C2 callbacks are hidden typically. They're command and control, that's what C2 stands for, and they're typically hidden from AV because they're using ports that you wouldn't expect, or that other things use, and it's all basically built in to look like traditional traffic that you would expect. And there's lots of ways to use Active Directory that have zero to do with any AV you're running. The way Active Directory is, by its nature, set up. There's all kinds of cool things you can do to attack it if nobody's bothered to actually secure it, because it isn't secure by default. Okay, so let's just say we have lots of phenomenal EDR, AV, whatever, pick your choice of tool of the day, and we say, cool, we can detect, these particular tactics, right? So, who has seen the chart that's on the right? Well, probably your left, but my right. At least a few of you, right? So this is the attack matrix. And what this is supposed to show is categorization of different kinds of ways in. So this is hard to see, but it says initial access, execution, persistence. These are the stages of an attack. And what these things are supposed to stand for are the different ways you can do those things. The green, in theory, is meant to say we have something that will detect that technique. And the red, presumably, is that we haven't found any, we don't have a detection in place for that, and yellow is maybe we're working on it. The problem is these heat maps, which is what this is called. Companies will build their infrastructure around these heat maps. Look, we can detect this, we're good. Cool. Except that attackers use different, not just different techniques, but what are called different procedures. The difference between a technique and a procedure, a technique is a way in which you can execute whatever it is you're trying to do, right? So steal passwords. I'm going to steal passwords through LSAS memory. But check it out. There are a billion ways to do that, even knowing you're using LSAS memory. Mimikatz is one. There are tons of others. Those are procedures. How the threat actor actually does those things, that's a procedure. And even if you have something that can detect a tactic, which is what most of this refers to, you don't necessarily have every procedure that the threat actor is doing. So what does green really mean here? Like, does it mean anything? Well, it means you have something in place, but it doesn't really tell the story. It's missing half the story, right? So this is what's called the TTP pyramid, and this is what breaks down tactics, techniques, and procedures. Christopher Peacock is the gentleman who built this. He works for a company called Scythe, and he gave me permission to use this, and he's awesome. I got to meet him at ShmooCon this year. So it's really important to understand that it's not just about how, what way in which they're going to try to do something generally, but how specifically, procedurally, it's being done. Okay. So let's assume our tools work as designed. Can we even do that? Who has had any fun and joy with the Microsoft Cloud products? Just any. So let me tell you, from a Defender perspective, they change the freaking back end of that thing every time you turn around. So when you assume it works as designed, well, who's designing it this week, right?
It's true.
I mean, it's crazy. So one of the researchers, I think this is a fabulous example. There's a researcher named Will Dorman who he started doing some research because Microsoft claims that if you use certain settings, you can automatically block dangerous drivers. So drivers that they've determined have flaws in them, and so folks shouldn't be using them. Well, the way that they are supposed to block them is there's supposed to be a block list. And what Will discovered was, check it out, initially, he discovered the block list wasn't enabled at all, despite the fact that Microsoft is like, look, we have a block list. Nope, no block list. Doesn't exist. Now, because of his research, they've implemented a block list. But it's not updated very often. So if you have a driver that is bad, you don't know when that bad driver is going to wind up on the block list. So there's some manual ways you can update it, but it's problematic. So in theory, this HVCI, having that enabled was supposed to solve this problem, but it didn't. And then they had another feature called attack surface reduction, and it wasn't able to block things either. So he did a bunch of research. So if you assume that your tools work as designed and you don't test them or you don't read up on the research about them, again, you're making a huge assumption. Because let me tell you, both attackers and offensive security folks, they know what doesn't work as designed because that's what they're taking advantage of. That's exactly the point. So this was some research by Olaf Hartong. He determined that Defender for Endpoint, even though it is supposed to detect certain things, it turns out that the telemetry that would need to be captured to determine whether or not the bad thing was detected wasn't turned on in certain cases. So here's yet another situation where you're assuming that these entries are going to be caught, but hello, by default, it's not set up to actually catch those things. You have to turn logging on workstations for certain events that aren't there by default. And if you, as a defender, don't know that, well, then you're never going to turn them on, and all bets are off.
It's not well documented.
What?
It's not well documented.
No, it is horribly not well documented. But Olaf's work, he's done a lot of work in this area, and he's got the link that I have here is a video where he kind of walks through and shows like how he discovered this and what he discovered, and he continues to do research. So if it's something you're interested in, you can follow his work. All right, we have MFA. We're good. We are not phishable. And I laugh when I hear this. I'm hearing some of you laugh to hear this. But there are organizations out there that think because they have MFA, they're good. And guess what? Not so much. Because there's ways around everything, including MFA. Certainly fatigue, right? Push, 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 push. If I'm an attacker and I want to get in, I just keep pushing. And eventually, they're going to go, oh, I'm so tired of this. Click, okay. Right? Or users go, well, I can't remember. Did I look? Okay, right? And we see that. Legacy protocols don't care about MFA typically, and a lot of people don't realize that. So even if you think you've locked everything down, you have MFA turned on, and you have legacy protocols enabled, all bets are off. Unexpired passcodes is another one I find a lot of people don't know about. So with most MFA types, one option is to print out a bunch of passcodes, so if you screw up and you lose your information or whatever, you have a way to get back in. The problem is they don't expire unless you generate a new set.
Yes.
So that's a problem because they're good forever, and if they're good forever and I'm an attacker and I get a hold of them because you've saved it in a document in your documents folder, or you left it on your desk, or you've done something with it such that I can access it. Or you stored it in, in a password manager.
You put it in your wallet and you lose your wallet?
I mean, there's a million options. But the point is that passcodes don't expire by default. There are some ways in some products where you can change that, but it is the default not to change. And then there's also straight up attacks. So I don't like man in the middle. I think that is now antiquated, so this is attacker in the middle, for those of you who are not familiar. So there are attacks you can do past the cookie. So there's a lot of social engineering attacks you can do to get around MFA. If you Google Dave Kennedy and then bypass MFA, he's got actually a couple of great things that he's done around this subject. But there are lots of attacks that can do this. So again, we can't just rely on that. Told you I'd bring back the sloth. So because we, as defenders, wind up seeing all of this stuff in a very traditional defense light, which is that half the story. Ultimately, my argument is you need to understand the other half of the story, which means turning ideas on their heads, my little friend, and looking at the world in a different way. Enter offensive security. Now, I'm not saying you all need to become offensive security professionals. I'm not an offensive security professional, nor will I ever be an offensive security professional. It's not something that I choose to want to pursue. But if you start to understand the way they think and the way they act, at the end of the day, you're learning the other half of that story that you're missing. So, for anyone who's not familiar, this is essentially what the path looks like for them. For those of you who are in offensive security, would you agree that this is more or less what you do when you go after an org or a person or whatever you're attacking? Yeah. I mean, it's a very general, but these are the questions they're asking. You're saying, all right, who are we going to attack? And the reasons vary. How are we going to get in? And then once we're in, how do we stay in without being noticed? And then expansion, right? This is that relationship thing I was talking about. Depending on the type of engagement offensive security and or an attacker is doing, there's an end game. The end game with attackers most of the time is money driven. So what is it they're trying to get at that's going to get them money? Is it just a set of creds? Is it company secrets? Is it, whatever?
Is it IP?
What?
Is it IP?
Is it IP? Yes, absolutely. So it could be any one of those things. But this is the key, is expansion. Because once they get in, they're like, this is what I want. How do I get there? And this is where those relationships become just incredibly important. So if you're just looking at your perimeter or you're just looking at certain systems and you think, I've done all the things I'm good, now you have to take that step back and say, all right, if I'm an attacker and I'm going through these steps and I get in, because they're going to get in, the question is, depending on where they land, what steps do they then have to take to get to wherever that crown jewel or important piece of information is? That's what you have to think about. That's the other half of the story, which you don't know if all you've ever been taught is patch the thing and scan the thing and whatever, right? So the way you start to learn to think about that, and I like this idea of immersion into the offensive security mindset, which is really a hacker mindset, and because many of you are here, you're learning a lot of this now. You need to find OffSec professionals to hang out with. Well, lucky you, because there's some right in this room, so that's awesome. Obviously, you can find them at Security BSides. You've done that. But there's other security conferences. There's other places you can go. 2600, which Matt mentioned, has a chapter in Rochester. A bunch of folks hang out there. Obviously, other local security meetups, so InfoSec 716 that Matt has here. There are DEF CON groups, online community. I mean, there's a zillion ways to meet other offensive security folks. And the more folks you kind of start to get to know, the more conversations you have, the better. And then if you want training, there's lots of choices there too. Different conferences have training classes. And you don't have to be like, well, I'm going to become an offensive security professional, so I'm going to take this training. You can be, I'm a defender, and I want to understand more about what they do, which makes me better at what I do, and start thinking that way. You can go to conference trainings. There are security companies. I love mentioning Anti-Siphon. Anti-Siphon, the folks who are doing our CTF, they make a bunch of the stuff for Anti-Siphon. So there's fabulous training there. Black Hills has training. If you're not familiar with Black Hills, they're amazing. They have a bunch of pay as you can. So literally, if you can't afford it, it's free. There are other companies, Trusted SAC, Offensive Security is a company, and of course SANS is like the creme de la creme, like $10 billion for training, but I mention it because it is an option. And there are some ways to get SANS training that's a little more tolerable. They have a work-study program that makes classes, I think, like $2,500 instead of like $10 grand. So, you know, it's a something. There's online stuff. If you're not familiar, these Hack the Box, Try Hack Me, there's CTS, YouTube, and even higher education. We've got classes, you know, a variety of schools have these things. So there's lots of options for training. One of the other things that offensive security folks tend to know about is they know about tradecraft. So tradecraft, what I mean by that here, is literally the craft of doing the offensive security, how they do it, what kinds of techniques and procedures they're doing. Well, if you read about attackers and you read how they did stuff, which is what these first two will teach you, they are researchers who research this stuff, and you can learn how those folks did those attacks, which is really cool. There's also Discord, Slack, Twitter, Mastodon, you know, any one of a number of other social media places that you can go. And the more folks you get to know, again, you begin to find out about tradecraft intel and how folks do what they do. There's also organizational intel. And there was a fabulous talk this morning that touched a little bit on this subject, because the more you can find out about your own organization and what attackers could use against you, the better off you are. So, you know, make no mistake, anytime you put up a LinkedIn profile and you put in stuff about the tools you're using, you just broadcast to the universe, hey, we use these tools in our organization. And now any attacker and anybody who, you know, wants to come after you, whether it's legitimate because they're OffSec folk and they're being hired to do it, or they're, you know, bad folk who are after you, they can see that information too. So be aware that, you know, like if you look at my LinkedIn profile, you will see stuff from many years ago, because no one cares that, you know, I ran an NT40 network, you know, 20 years ago, because it's gone. So you can come after it, but you won't find it.
25 floppy.
Yeah, 25 on it. Well, that was 351. NT40 was on the CD.
Oh.
If attackers can get in and you have an internal wiki, it's another great spot to find stuff. Have I been pwned can be used by attackers as well as defenders. So, you know, be aware that there's these different kinds of intelligence. There's organizational intel and then there's tradecraft intel. And both of those things are important to understand. I am not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is a humongous list. I encourage you to take a picture if you've never heard of some of these things. These are very common tools attackers use. And offensive security folks also use. You'll see a couple that we've already touched on. So Bloodhound, we talked about. SharpHound is the thing that does the data collection. Azure Hound is the same thing for the Azure environment instead of your traditional AD environment. But all of these tools can be used for good or for ill. It's just that most defenders don't know they exist because they're only focused on defense and not exactly what they're defending against. Again, missing that other half of the story. Everybody get the pictures they want? Okay. So at the end of the day, realize the most important thing that you get out of this is to understand that what we learn as defenders in terms of being sysadmins and doing general security is only half the story. You really, really, really need to understand the other half. Which again, does not mean you have to become an offensive security professional. It means you need to spend time with them. You need to start understanding how they think about things. And the more you are around that and the more you spend time in that space, the more you will start thinking in the same way, the better defender you will be. Be aware of assumptions. Folks make assumptions about controls in particular all the time. Microsoft says if I check this box, then no one can do fill in the blank. Let me tell you, there's almost always a way around that. Almost always. You know, and so it's great to put controls in place. But if you stop there and you don't think about, well, what if this control failed? Again, you're missing the other half of the story. So jump into that other half. Get to know some more OffSec folks. There's a bunch here. And learn what they know, both about their tradecraft and their tools. Because again, it will make you a better defender. If you like what I had to say here, I have to shill my book. So this is called the Active Defender. It will be out July 25th. It is currently in pre-sale. Wiley is my publisher. I'm very excited about this. For those of you who are familiar with some of the larger names in this space, Jake Williams was my technical editor, and I'm honored to have had him on board for this. I also talked to a ton of other people that are fairly well known in this space. And this idea was born because I realized, hey, there's this other half of the story, right? And more people need to know about it. So this goes into sort of all this stuff in much more detail. So if you found this interesting, you might find it.
How do you get an
Pre-order on
autographed copy?
Amazon?
So once you get it, I am at lots of conferences. If you come to Vegas for summer camp, I'll be there. I'll be at Info Booth at BSides Vegas and at Hacking Village at DEF CON. I come to InfoSec in-person meetups when I can. If you want to arrange something, I'm on the InfoSec 716 Discord. I'm very happy to sign copies if it's just that, like during summer camp, you have to come to me because I won't have time to come find you. But yes, I'm more than happy to do that. Was there another question?
Yes, maybe an obvious question. Is it pre-order on Amazon?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Wiley's website,
Okay.
yep, all three.
And Craigslist.
So probably not quite yet, but eventually.
I'll put it up there.
So you mentioned that your signature and your autograph are two different images, right?
Oh, yeah. So I like to end with this quote from Douglas Adams because, as I mentioned, the story of how I got into IT is a very different story from how I wound up in security. But needless to say, in both cases, I did not intend to wind up here. This is not where I was going to wind up. But it is clearly where I needed to be. So I'm very glad to have you all here. And with that, I'll take any questions you have.
So as a pro services engineer, I find one of the biggest assumptions is that if people think they have good technical security, that they're going to meet regulatory compliance. And that is a huge assumption that is often very wrong.
And vice versa, right? If you have compliance, it doesn't mean you're secure. And if you're secure, it doesn't mean you meet compliance standards.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Yeah, you got to map those technical controls to the compliance standards.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
What do you think of purple teaming? And is that similar to like what, I mean, it might be a stupid question, but is that similar to what you were talking about today?
So purple teaming is awesome. I talk about it more in the book.
Okay.
Purple teaming is this idea that somebody who works in offensive security and people who work in defensive security ultimately work together. So offensive security will attack something. Defense will look to see, what the visibility was. Can they see what the attackers did? And if they can't, why not? And what has to be built to see that attack? And then if they got in, what can they do to have prevented it? So it is an ongoing conversation that happens during that engagement. And there are people who will define this differently, but in my opinion, for a true purple team, that's what has to happen. It's not, well, we did stuff, and then we did stuff. It's literally almost a side-by-side engagement working together in concert. And I think it's super awesome. It is definitely one of the best ways to get a big picture of what's going on. Many companies aren't there yet. Like that tends to be something that's a little more advanced, which doesn't mean you can't do it earlier. It just means it depends on the company. Yeah.
Do you find that, I mean, I don't know how many different companies you see, but it seems to me that just about every company has blue team.
Yep.
And maybe a fifth of them, I'm just kind of flagging, have red.
Yeah, so very few companies have their own offensive security teams. Some larger companies do.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's far less common.
But it's also not the same if you just hire a pen tester once a year.
Well, and this is where we get into the distinction between a pen tester and a red team, and that's a whole rabbit hole. The very short version of that is, if you're hiring a third-party consultant, think about what you want to get out of that consulting gig. Don't worry about what it's called. Again, I have a whole section in the book that talks about that subject because I find that people get really wrapped up in the words.
Terms, yeah.
And the words aren't important. What is important is, I want to know this.
The scope of the engagement.
Yes, absolutely.
When I worked for the feds, I was on compliance for FISMA,
Mm-hmm.
Federal Information Security Management Act, or at least that's what it was originally. And it was denigrated as a paperwork exercise, which in some cases is kind of true. However, paperwork is the air that they live and breathe in Washington, D.C.
Sure.
And before they enforced FISMA, they were totally unprotected and nobody wanted to do anything. So it's kind of easy to dump on defensive security, but it's the point you're making, I think, is that that's only halfway there.
Yeah.
Only halfway there. But we had to get there first before it started to make a difference.
Yeah. So for those of you who couldn't hear the comment, so basically the gist of it is a lot of defense was born from kind of a need for even the basic patching and the things we're doing. And in a FISMA situation, we weren't even necessarily doing those things until those compliances, requirements came around. And that's very true. But I think we're now at a point where there's enough regulatory stuff out there. People know, generally speaking, at this point, the patching, the things they're supposed to be doing in that very basic level, but they're not really thinking about what they're defending against. They're just defending, and that's that other half of the story. So, yes.
As a red teamer, I love that you mentioned Bloodhound. I'm not surprised but saddened by how many blue teamers and IT folks, sysadmins, network don't know about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because we often find some really, really weird stuff in there. You were testing something out 10 years ago and you give domain users write privileges to domain controllers group policy. You forgot about it. It has been 10 years.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, and it's one to acknowledge that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's Bloodhound is a great tool. It can show you a lot of things. I mentioned the tool set that I have up here. Be aware that you need to ask for permission before you use those tools on your network.
And ask permission before you visit places like Shodan, because some places filter on that.
Yeah.
Definitely Bloodhound, right?
But,
Ask permission.
but I mean, the point is, if you know these tools are out there and you understand what they do, then when somebody says to you,
Well,
You can come back to work.
can this bad thing happen? And you're like, oh no, we're protected from this, but then you understand how these tools get around those protections.
I was going to say, if you're going to do a showdown survey, do it at home and take the results.
Yeah, so I mean, that's really why I show those tools, because a lot of people don't know they exist, they don't know what they're capable of doing. I do spend a bunch of time talking about some of those tools in the book and saying, like, here's what they can do, and as a defender, here's essentially what you'll have to do to deal with them. But if you're not even aware of them and they're running in your org,
The one thing I would add to that, for tools, is make a map of your network. Most people don't have a business map of their network to show how the devices are connected. Make that as a starting point. That will give you the starting point map that you need to start looking at relationships with things. Because there's the data path of the stuff, and then there's how the different devices have their permissions to talk to each other, and shared permissions, and a whole bunch of other things. But the basic map of your network layout is the thing that'll get you started in looking at what talks to what and where the data flows.
and if you don't think you can do that because you're like, oh my God, that sounds overwhelming, anytime an offensive security team comes in and starts looking, it's one of the first things they do.
Yes.
And it doesn't take as long as you think it does.
It's free tools.
It's
Yeah,
free
and
tools
it's
and it's
like
really
that.
fast.
You had a question, yes?
Similar to the question about purple teaming, and also I know there's a talk on this later, but where do you think threat hunting fits into your overall?
So threat hunting is something that what I would call the active defender, which takes a whole lot of more time than I have to describe. But I think threat hunting is important, really, really important. And I think it can happen much earlier than a lot of people realize, because all you really need is, some kind of log and some threat to look for. So what I find is that people think, oh, you have to have this really mature environment to start threat hunting. No, you have to have a hypothesis about something bad that could happen. And you have to know what logs and what you do have access to. And given what you have access to, what indicators might be in those logs, and go look for it. It doesn't need to be complicated. So it's definitely something that that defenders should be doing, but the way to do that well is to understand what attackers are doing, and threat hunting is really very difficult to do if you don't understand that side. So, and if anybody else has questions, I'll be outside, but there is somebody else coming in here, and so again, thank you so very much for coming.